There is a particular kind of tiredness that does not come from doing too much. It comes from thinking too much, and then thinking about the thinking, and then, somewhere around midnight, realizing you are exhausted and somehow still going. You have probably tried to close the tabs, told yourself, stop, not now, let it go, and watched your brain open 3 more. That is not a failure of willpower. That is a very specific kind of brain, one that science has spent the last 2 decades finally learning to read. Welcome to Psychology for Sleep. Tonight, the science is not here to fix you. It is here to explain what has been happening all along, and why the brain that won't quiet down is not the brain you think it is. You are already somewhere quiet. Let your shoulders settle. Not all the way, just enough to notice they were raised. And now we begin. You know the feeling of trying to sleep and finding that your mind has other plans. You close your eyes and the thoughts don't dim. They organize. A conversation from Tuesday, a task you forgot, something you said in 2014. Science has a name for the system running those thoughts, the default mode network, or DMN. It is a web of brain regions that activates specifically when you are not focused on a task, when you lie down, when you look away, when you try to rest. In most brains, the DMN quiets when attention is needed. In ADHD brains, it does not fully disengage. It keeps running, not because something is wrong, but because it was built for a different kind of always. The default mode network was first mapped in the early 2000s by neuroscientist Marcus Reichel, who noticed that certain brain regions became more active during rest than during focused tasks. He called this the resting state. And for years, scientists assumed it was just idle background noise. Then they looked more carefully. The DMN they found is not idle at all. It is processing memory, imagining the future, making sense of social situations, rehearsing conversations, building and rebuilding identity. In ADHD brains, this system is chronically hyperactive. The background noise is, in fact, the loudest thing in the room, not because it is broken, but because it was never given a reason to stop. If you have ever noticed that your most intrusive thoughts arrive exactly when you lie down to sleep, you are experiencing something researchers call sleep-onset cognitive arousal. It is not anxiety in the clinical sense. It is the DMN filling the silence. In the absence of external stimulation, the ADHD brain does not drift toward rest. It accelerates toward processing. The quiet is not empty. The quiet is what makes space for everything that didn't get processed during the day to finally speak up. This is not malfunction. This is a backlog. And recognizing it as such changes the feeling of lying awake from failure into something closer to understanding. The tab metaphor, the sense of a browser with too many windows open, is not just a metaphor. It maps onto real neural architecture. Each open tab corresponds to an active working memory trace, a partially resolved thought, an intention not yet completed. In cognitive science, these are called open loops. The Zeigarnik effect, first documented in the 1920s, shows that the brain holds incomplete tasks in a kind of persistent activation, returning to them until they are finished or consciously released. ADHD brains have more open loops at rest than neurotypical brains. The tabs are not metaphorical. They are electrical, and they are running right now, faithfully, the way they always have. One reason ADHD brains struggle to close the tabs is dopamine. Specifically, the way the ADHD brain regulates it. Dopamine is not just a reward chemical. It is a signal of relevance, a message that says this matters. Stay here. In ADHD brains, dopamine signaling is lower at baseline, which means the brain is constantly scanning for something interesting enough to hold attention. At night, with no new input, it begins generating its own, revisiting memories, catastrophizing, spiraling. Because the dopamine system will not accept boredom as a resting state. The tabs open because the brain is, in a very literal sense, still searching for something worth staying interested in. The brain region most associated with ADHD overthinking is the anterior cingulate cortex, a structure involved in conflict monitoring and error detection. In ADHD brains, this region is often hyperactive, persistently scanning for mistakes, inconsistencies, unresolved problems. This is why the two A.M. thoughts so often take the form of things that went wrong, not to torment, but because the brain's error monitoring system is still working the overnight shift. It is not rumination. It is a very thorough quality control department that hasn't received the memo that the workday has ended. Still at its desk. Still checking. Still finding one more thing to review before it can rest. Research has found that children and adults with ADHD show significantly more mind-wandering during quiet periods than neurotypical individuals. Not because they lack focus, but because their D.M.N. fails to suppress when it should. In neurotypical brains, the D.M.N. and the task-positive network operate like a seesaw. When one is up, the other is down. In ADHD brains, both can be partially active simultaneously, like running two operating systems at once, each drawing on the same limited processing budget. This is cognitively expensive. This is why you can be exhausted from thinking without having thought about anything that needed thinking. The system was running full capacity on something that had nowhere to land. There is a structure deep in the brain called the locus coeruleus, a small cluster of neurons in the brainstem that regulates norepinephrine, the brain's alertness chemical. In ADHD, the locus coeruleus fires more readily in response to internal stimuli, meaning the ADHD brain can generate its own arousal signal from the inside. A thought becomes a spark. The spark becomes wakefulness. The wakefulness generates more thoughts. This is not anxiety. This is a feedback loop with a hair trigger. And it runs exactly when the rest of the body is trying to wind down. The body lies still while the brainstem quietly keeps the engine turning, unaware that no one is driving. You may have noticed that ADHD overthinking does not feel like panic. It feels like interest, like something you genuinely want to figure out right now, tonight. before anything else. This is because the Dopamine in ADHD brains activates the brain's reward circuitry at the same time. The thought that won't let go isn't just persisting. It's rewarding. The brain experiences the pursuit of an open question as a mild dopamine hit, which reinforces the cycle. The tab stays open because closing it doesn't feel as good as thinking about it one more time. The brain is not misbehaving. It is doing what rewarded behavior always does, coming back. And this is only the beginning of what the default mode network reveals about the way cognitive fatigue actually works. Every fact in tonight's science comes back to one observation. The brain that is hardest to silence at night is often the same brain that has been working hardest all day. Not at tasks, but at existing, at filtering, at processing, at keeping pace with a world that moves on a different schedule. What science has learned is that ADHD overthinking is not weakness multiplied. It is strength without a break. A system that never got the signal that it was allowed to stop, because no one ever gave it one. Sleep researchers have identified a phenomenon called pre-sleep cognitive activity, the mental content that occupies the mind in the 30 minutes before sleep. In neurotypical adults, this content tends to be neutral to positive and declines in intensity as sleep approaches. In adults with ADHD, pre-sleep cognitive activity tends to be higher in intensity, more emotionally loaded, and more likely to involve future planning and past regret simultaneously. The brain is not just reviewing the day, it is rehearsing tomorrow. It is correcting yesterday. It is doing both at the same time in two separate mental windows, each demanding equal attention, neither willing to close until the other does first. One of the more striking findings in ADHD sleep research involves something called cortical hyperarousal, an elevated state of electrical activity in the brain that persists into the night. Studies have shown that ADHD brains, particularly in the frontal lobes, display beta wave activity at bedtime when theta and delta waves should be taking over. Beta waves are associated with active thinking, alertness, problem solving, the opposite of rest. They are precisely the wrong frequency for sleep onset. The ADHD brain, in neurological terms, is still in work mode when the rest of the body has clocked out, still running the frequency of a Tuesday morning at an hour that belongs to somewhere much quieter. The prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive command center, plays a central role in ADHD overthinking. In neurotypical brains, the prefrontal cortex helps regulate the Dopamine, sending inhibitory signals that slow down mind wandering when rest is needed. In ADHD brains, this regulatory pathway is underactive, not absent, but quieter. The inhibitory signal exists. It just doesn't carry the same weight when it arrives. The executive tries to file the tabs. It sends the instruction. The tabs hear it, acknowledge it in some distant way, and remain exactly where they are. Open, lit, still running, indifferent to the request. ADHD brains have been found to show greater neural noise. Random, spontaneous firing that has no clear source or target. This neural noise contributes to the feeling of mental static thoughts that arise from nowhere, associations that appear without being summoned, the sense that thinking is happening to you rather than by you. This is not disorganization. It is a system with a lower signal-to-noise ratio, experiencing everything more vividly, including its own interior weather. The static isn't a sign of malfunction. It's the sound of a brain that picks up signals other brains have learned to tune out. There is a concept in sleep science called sleep pressure, the buildup of adenosine in the brain during waking hours, which increases the biological drive to sleep. In ADHD brains, the response to sleep pressure is often blunted. The system that says enough, rest now, registers later, quieter, less urgently than in neurotypical brains. This means that the ADHD person lying awake at midnight is not simply choosing wakefulness. Their brain has not yet received the signal loudly enough that sleep is biologically appropriate. The body is ready. The brain has not gotten the memo. There is no stubbornness here. There is only a message that hasn't arrived yet. The 2 a.m. replay of a conversation you had 3 days ago is not random. Your brain is reprocessing the emotional data of that interaction, running the social simulation again to extract meaning, recalibrate your sense of how others see you, and resolve any ambiguity the exchange left behind. Research in social neuroscience suggests that the brain's social processing networks remain active long after an interaction has ended, particularly when the emotional outcome was uncertain or unresolved. This is the brain doing necessary work. It has simply chosen an unhelpful time, the way a conscientious editor might return to a manuscript at midnight, convinced there is one more thing to catch. Researchers found that suppressing a thought, actively trying not to think about something, reliably increases the frequency and intensity of that thought in ADHD brains. This is the white bear effect, first documented by Daniel Wegner in the 1980s. Tell yourself not to think of a white bear, and the white bear appears. In ADHD brains, the effect is amplified because the monitoring system, the part of the brain that checks whether you're still thinking the forbidden thought, is itself hyperactive. The suppression attempt becomes the stimulus. The tab opens faster the harder you try to close it. The instruction to stop is, in this architecture, an invitation to continue. The cerebellum, long considered only a motor coordination center, has been increasingly implicated in ADHD cognitive patterns. New research shows the cerebellum plays a role in timing, not just physical timing, but cognitive timing. The sense of when a thought has gone on long enough and should conclude. In ADHD brains, cerebellar timing networks are dysregulated, which contributes to thoughts that run past their useful end. The thought doesn't know it is finished. It keeps going the way a sentence might keep going past the point where its meaning was already complete, still adding words, still finding more to say, while the reader waits patiently for the period that never quite comes. The insula, a structure buried in the folds of the cerebral cortex, integrates bodily sensations with emotional and cognitive processing. In ADHD, insular connectivity is disrupted, which means the brain has a harder time using the body's signals. Fatigue, tension, heaviness, as cues to stop thinking. In neurotypical brains, Physical tiredness sends a relatively clear signal to the cognitive system wind down. In ADHD brains, that signal is partially disconnected. The body can be profoundly exhausted while the mind continues to argue, plan, and process as if it were 10 in the morning, unaware that the floor beneath it has been ready to rest for hours. There is a rhythm to healthy brain activity called the infraslow oscillation, a very slow electrical wave, less than 0.1 Hertz, that coordinates large-scale brain networks and is strongly associated with sleep transitions. In ADHD, these oscillations are irregular. The brain does not slide smoothly from wakefulness into rest. It stutters. It dips and resurfaces. This is part of why the ADHD sleep experience so often involves long liminal periods, lying awake, half present, not quite asleep, the thoughts quieting and then suddenly resuming, as though the volume knob were being turned by someone who can't quite decide, going back and forth across the same uncertain threshold. Research has examined the relationship between ADHD traits and what researchers call bedtime procrastination, the tendency to delay sleep despite feeling tired. Studies suggest this behavior is not primarily driven by poor time management, but by the emotional experience of nighttime being the only period of genuine quiet in an overstimulating day. For many ADHD adults, bedtime is when the external demands finally stop, and the mind, having been managed and redirected all day, finally gets to pursue its own interests. The staying awake is not insomnia. It is the first free hour of the day, the one moment when no one is asking the brain to be somewhere other than where it wants to be. Emotional dysregulation. The difficulty managing the intensity and duration of emotional responses is increasingly recognized as a central feature of ADHD, not a side effect. Research suggests that the emotional processing circuits in ADHD brains are more reactive at initial contact with a stimulus and slower to return to baseline afterward. An argument that ended hours ago can still be generating neural activity. A moment of embarrassment from the morning is still processing at midnight. The emotional half-life in ADHD brains is longer. Things take more time to finish being felt. Not because the feelings are excessive, but because the system that files them away takes the work seriously and won't rush. Sleep architecture. The structure of sleep cycles across a night is measurably different in ADHD adults. Polysomnography studies show that ADHD adults spend more time in light sleep stages and less time in slow-wave deep sleep, even when total sleep duration is normal. Deep sleep is when the brain's waste clearance processes are most active, flushing metabolic byproducts, including those associated with cognitive fatigue. Less deep sleep means less clearance. Less clearance means waking up with a brain that feels like it worked all night. Because, in a meaningful sense, it did. The evidence for these clearance mechanisms is still developing in human studies, but the sleep architecture difference itself is well established and consistently replicated. The thalamus, a relay station that routes sensory information to the appropriate brain regions, plays an important role in filtering what reaches conscious awareness during sleep. In ADHD, thalamic gating is less effective. More internal noise passes through the filter. This is part of why ADHD brains are more easily awakened by their own thoughts than neurotypical brains. The system that blocks internally generated signals from rising to consciousness is operating at lower sensitivity. The thoughts aren't louder. The door is simply more open and more willing to let through the quiet knock of a thought that, in another brain, would never have made it past the threshold. What 25 facts of neuroscience are pointing toward is not a diagnosis. It is a pattern. The portrait of a brain that experiences everything at slightly higher resolution than it was designed to filter. The tabs are not open because of weakness. They are open because the system that closes them was never built with the same inhibitory weight. What this tells us is not about ADHD alone. It tells us something about the way effort actually works in a brain where the effort never fully stops. The next arc of science goes deeper, not into what the brain is doing wrong, but into what it is doing instead, and why that distinction changes everything. 25 facts, and each one has been pointing at the same thing. The brain you carry is not broken, it is thorough. It wants to finish what it started, and sometimes it started everything. Right now, there is nothing left to start. Let the tabs stay where they are. You don't have to close them tonight. Just notice you are already here, breathing, still. The next hour follows one question, not about what the brain does wrong, but about what it has been trying to protect. The concept of hyperfocus, the ADHD brain's ability to lock onto something so completely that time and hunger and tiredness disappear, is the same mechanism as overthinking, running in a different direction. Both are expressions of the same neural state, elevated dopamine, in response to a stimulus the brain has judged to be interesting. During hyperfocus, the interesting thing is external. During nighttime overthinking, the interesting thing is a thought. The brain has not malfunctioned. It has found something to care about. And it is doing what it always does. Going all the way in. Research consistently shows that approximately 73 to 78% of adults with ADHD experience significant sleep disturbance, compared to 35% in the general population. But the nature of the disturbance matters. ADHD sleep problems are predominantly sleep-onset difficulties, trouble falling asleep, rather than sleep maintenance difficulties. The mind does not refuse sleep because it is afraid of it. It refuses because it genuinely has not finished thinking yet. There is, in this, a kind of integrity, the brain insisting on completing its work before resting. The exhaustion that results is the price of that integrity. Norepinephrine, the brain's alertness and attention chemical, follows a different circadian pattern in ADHD brains. In neurotypical adults, norepinephrine levels decline in the evening, facilitating the shift from alertness to rest. In ADHD brains, this decline is often delayed by 1 to 3 hours, contributing to a phenomenon researchers call delayed sleep phase. The natural sleep window shifts later, so that 11 p.m. feels like 8 p.m. And the brain is genuinely not ready for sleep when the clock says it should be. The staying awake is not a choice. It is a time zone difference inside the same skull. A key difference between ADHD, mind-wandering, and anxiety-driven rumination lies in the emotional valence of the content. Anxiety rumination tends to circle around fear and threat. What might go wrong? What is already wrong? ADHD overthinking tends to be more varied, creative, associative, curious, and emotionally mixed. It visits the embarrassing and the fascinating with equal energy. This distinction matters because it changes what the mind is doing, not bracing for danger, but processing experience, still open, still taking things in, still trying to make sense of a world it finds genuinely interesting. The ADHD brain's relationship to time is fundamentally different from the neurotypical experience. Researchers describe this as time blindness, not a deficit of intelligence or care, but a difference in the subjective experience of time's passage. In the context of sleep, this manifests as the inability to feel how long you have been lying awake. 20 minutes feels like 5. An hour passes inside a single thought. The brain is not registering time's passage because it is fully absorbed in the experience of its own interior. This is not insomnia in the conventional sense. This is immersion. Memory processing works differently in ADHD during rest. While neurotypical brains at rest tend to revisit episodic memory, personal experiences, recent events, ADHD brains at rest show more activation across associative and conceptual networks, making connections between ideas, building frameworks, asking how things relate. The midnight thoughts that feel like random tangents are often underneath. The brain doing genuine intellectual synthesis. The connection it's drawing between something that happened years ago and something you read last week is real. It's just happening at an inconvenient hour, in a room where everyone else has already gone to sleep. The basal ganglia, a set of structures deep in the brain involved in habit formation and inhibitory control, plays a central role in ADHD. When the basal ganglia sends a stop signal, the action or thought being suppressed should quiet. In ADHD brains, the stop signal is weaker, not absent, but quieter, like a request rather than an instruction. This means that thoughts that should naturally conclude keep running a few seconds longer than necessary. A few seconds, multiplied across hundreds of thoughts per evening, becomes an hour of lying awake. The basal ganglia is trying. The signal just doesn't carry the same authority. Working memory, the brain's short-term cognitive workspace, is typically reduced in ADHD. This creates a particular challenge at bedtime. The brain, aware that its working memory is unreliable, often resists sleep because sleep will wipe the slate. The thought that will not let go is sometimes a thought the brain is afraid to lose. The open tab is not just demanding attention. It is the brain's version of leaving a note to itself. What looks like inability to stop is sometimes, at its root, a fear of forgetting something that felt worth remembering. Researchers have identified a distinct brain state called task-unrelated thought, thinking that has no connection to any current goal or task. In neurotypical brains, task-unrelated thought decreases as bedtime approaches. In ADHD brains, it remains elevated or even increases. These unrelated thoughts are not random static. They have been shown to correlate with creative problem-solving the following day. The ADHD brain that can't stop thinking at night is, among other things, doing background processing that surfaces as insight in the morning. The 2 a.m. thought spiral may be generating tomorrow's best idea. Research from the Netherlands Institute for Neuroscience and other groups has found that the majority of adults with ADHD, estimates range from 73 to 78%, show a delayed circadian rhythm, including delayed melatonin onset. The brain is not ignoring sleep. It is simply not receiving the biological invitation at the same time as everyone else. When melatonin finally rises, sometimes hours later than typical, the ADHD person can fall asleep quickly and deeply. The system works. It just runs on a different clock, one that is never quite aligned with the one on the wall. The amygdala, the brain's emotional significance detector, is more readily activated in ADHD brains and slower to deactivate. This means that emotionally significant thoughts, once triggered, hold their arousal longer. A conversation remembered at 11 p.m. will still be generating amygdala activity at 1 a.m. The brain is not stuck in a loop. It is finishing a processing cycle that simply takes longer. Research suggests that full emotional processing of a significant social event takes measurably more time in ADHD brains than in neurotypical ones. Not because of deeper feeling, but because of slower clearance through the circuits that manage emotional recovery. There is a growing body of research on what scientists call ADHD paralysis, the state in which the ADHD brain, overwhelmed by the volume and complexity of its own thoughts, freezes rather than acts. At bedtime, this manifests as the experience of lying perfectly still while thoughts move at high speed, unable to sleep, but also unable to redirect, read, or get up. The brain has entered a kind of cognitive gridlock. Too many things demanding processing simultaneously. This is not laziness. This is a traffic jam in the most literal sense. Every lane is full, and no one can move. The phenomenon of rejection-sensitive dysphoria, an intense emotional response to perceived rejection or criticism, described by ADHD researcher William Dodson, has a neurological basis in the ADHD brain's dopamine and norepinephrine signaling. At night, without distraction, the ADHD brain often replays interactions through the lens of rejection sensitivity, amplifying neutral events into evidence of failure or exclusion. These midnight verdicts are not accurate assessments. They are the product of a system running in the absence of the counterweight, that social connection, activity, and daylight provide. They will look different in the morning. Sleep scientists have begun studying the relationship between ADHD and what some researchers describe as hyperactive hypnagogic states, the threshold between waking and sleeping, in which the ADHD brain generates unusually vivid, narratively complex imagery that engages it so thoroughly it delays the transition to actual sleep. In ADHD brains, this hypnagogic state is often prolonged and rich with content, mini-narratives, faces, scenarios, entire worlds appearing behind closed eyes. This is not a problem. It is the ADHD brain doing what it does, finding something fascinating at the edge of consciousness and following it in. Across these 40 facts, a single thread runs consistently. The ADHD brain is not refusing rest because it doesn't want it. It is refusing rest because it has not finished. And what it has not finished is not one thing. It is everything, simultaneously, with equal urgency and no clear way to prioritize. The science does not call this a disorder of attention. Increasingly, it calls this a disorder of regulation, the management of when things start and stop. The brain is doing the right things. The timing is off. And timing, as the next arc will reveal, is something that can change. You're still here, and your brain is doing what it always does, following something it finds worth following. The science ahead goes somewhere different, not into what's broken, into what's possible. Stay with it. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize its own structure and function in response to experience, applies to the default mode network. Studies using mindfulness-based interventions with ADHD adults have shown measurable changes in D-M-N connectivity after 8 to 12 weeks of consistent practice. The brain is not fixed. The pattern of tabs always open is a habit of neural firing. And habits change, not through willpower, through repetition of a different pattern, consistently enough that the brain begins to treat it as the new normal. The network that learned to run learns, slowly, to pause. Research has found that adults with ADHD who adopted consistent pre-sleep routines, not because of discipline, but because of predictability, showed significant reductions in sleep onset latency over time. The brain, it turns out, responds to ritual, not because ritual is calming in itself, but because it provides the predictable external structure that the ADHD brain's internal regulation system cannot fully generate on its own. The routine becomes the brake that the brain was never able to build from the inside. It works because the brain stops having to decide. And in the not deciding, something finally relaxes. Body-based practices, not mental ones, show the strongest evidence for ADHD sleep improvement: progressive muscle relaxation, slow diaphragmatic breathing, and gentle physical activity in the evening have been shown in multiple studies to reduce cortical hyperarousal in ADHD adults more effectively than cognitive approaches. The reason is neurological. The body has a more direct pathway to the brainstem's arousal centers than the thinking mind does. Telling the brain to calm down rarely works. Telling the body to soften often does. And the body, unlike the brain, does not argue with the instruction. Research into what some scientists call the extended evening effect in ADHD adults shows that the final 2 hours before intended sleep time are disproportionately influential in determining sleep onset. What happens in those hours? The stimulation level, the emotional content, the degree of screen exposure, shapes the brain's arousal state more powerfully than the previous 22 hours combined. The problem is not that ADHD brains can't sleep. It is that the runway for landing is very short, and it is almost impossible to land if the approach speed is too high. The evening is where the night is decided. Zinc, magnesium, and iron minerals frequently found to be lower in ADHD populations, played documented roles in dopamine synthesis and melatonin regulation. Research into magnesium supplementation has found reductions in sleep onset latency in adults with ADHD traits in some studies, suggesting that the ADHD brain's nighttime difficulty is not purely psychological. It has a biochemistry, and that biochemistry can be supported. This is not a cure, and results vary across individuals. But it points towards something meaningful. The tabs don't just need to be managed. The system running them sometimes needs to be fed. One of the more counterintuitive findings in ADHD sleep research involves exercise timing. Studies show that moderate aerobic exercise in the afternoon, specifically between 3 and 6 p.m., produces a measurable reduction in nighttime cortical arousal in ADHD adults, an effect not consistently seen with morning exercise. The mechanism involves the timing of cortisol's natural decline. Afternoon exercise appears to accelerate that decline in the evening, creating a steeper neurochemical slope toward rest. The brain can't always choose to slow down, but the body can be given a reason to. And the body, in this case, brings the brain along. Sensory environments matter more for ADHD sleep than for neurotypical sleep, because ADHD brains process sensory input with higher fidelity and slower habituation. A sound that a neurotypical brain tunes out in 3 seconds continues to register in an ADHD brain for 20 or 30. This makes the sleep environment, temperature, texture, sound, light, not a comfort preference but a neurological variable. The person who cannot sleep without white noise, who needs a particular weight of blanket, who is undone by a streetlight through the curtain, they are not being difficult. They are describing their nervous system accurately. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, adapted for ADHD, has shown promising results in reducing the cognitive arousal component of ADHD sleep difficulty. The key modification from standard C, B, T, I go is that ADHD-adapted versions do not ask the brain to stop thinking at bedtime, an instruction the ADHD brain cannot follow. Instead, they redirect the thinking toward low stimulation, low stakes, content slow, meandering mental narration of a neutral environment, not a blank mind. A mind given something boring to do. The tabs don't close. They just open something less interesting. And less interesting, it turns out, is close enough to rest. The ADHD brain's relationship to silence is fundamentally different from the neurotypical experience of it. Silence, for many ADHD adults, is not peaceful. It is loud with internally generated content. The brain, deprived of external input, increases its own signal. This is why ADHD adults so often need background sound to sleep. Not because silence is frightening, but because, in silence, the brain becomes its own loudest neighbor. Background sound provides just enough external input to give the auditory cortex something to process, reducing the space available for self-generated noise. The quiet that helps isn't empty. It's occupied just enough. 50 facts in. And the answer is taking shape. Though not the shape it might have seemed to be at the start. The central question was, how do you force close the thoughts before sleep? And the answer the science is assembling is you don't. Not by force. The ADHD brain cannot be commanded into stillness any more than a river can be commanded not to move. What the next 50 facts will show is not how to stop the current, but how to change what it's carrying. The question the second half follows is quieter, not how do I stop, but what does a brain like this need in order to feel safe enough to rest? Halfway. You are still here. Which means the part of you that needed to understand something is getting what it came for. Notice what is in contact with the surface beneath you. The weight of your arms, the heaviness that has always been there. The brain above that weight is still moving. Let it. You don't have to arrive anywhere tonight. The next 50 facts carry a different question. Not about what is wrong, but about what a brain like yours has always been trying to build. The question, what does an ADHD brain need in order to feel safe enough to rest, has a neurological answer: predictability. Research suggests that ADHD brains, chronically understimulated at baseline, respond to novel stimuli with a disproportionate dopamine response. This is part of why new things are so compelling, but it also means that repetition, same place, same time, same sequence, eventually loses its stimulating power. The brain habituates. The familiar becomes boring. Boring, for an ADHD brain, is close enough to safe. Interoception, the brain's awareness of internal bodily states, is often reduced in ADHD. This means that ADHD adults may not accurately sense their own level of physical fatigue, hunger, or tension. They reach exhaustion before recognizing it. This disconnection from the body's signals is part of why the just go to bed when you're tired advice fails for so many ADHD people. The signal that tiredness has arrived is unreliable. External cues. A set bedtime. A pre-sleep sequence. A room that dims at a consistent hour. Work better because they don't rely on a signal the brain isn't reading clearly. The brain's internal waste clearance processes, most active during slow-wave sleep, have been studied in relation to ADHD with growing interest. Preliminary research, primarily from animal models, suggests that chronic sleep disruption may reduce the efficiency of overnight clearance of proteins associated with cognitive function. While human evidence is still emerging and should be interpreted cautiously, the animal findings are consistent enough to take seriously. The brain that doesn't rest isn't just tired. It may be carrying more of what it was supposed to clear. Research into ADHD and emotional memory has revealed something quietly significant. ADHD brains tend to remember the emotional content of experiences more vividly than the factual details. A meeting from 3 months ago may be gone from memory, but how the meeting made you feel is stored with high fidelity. This asymmetry matters at bedtime because the thoughts that surface are not random memories. They are emotionally weighted ones. The brain is not replaying the whole day. It is revisiting the moments that still have unresolved emotional charge. It is not stuck in the past. It is trying to finish something. Studies on ADHD and creativity have found that the same neural networks associated with ADHD overthinking, the default mode network, the anterior cingulate, the diffuse attentional system, are the networks most strongly associated with creative cognition. The ADHD brain's tendency to make unexpected connections, to see patterns across unrelated domains, to follow a thought wherever it leads, rather than staying on a predetermined path. These are not disorders of thinking. They are a different style of thinking, one consistently associated with divergent problem-solving and original ideation. The tabs are also where the ideas live. The ADHD brain's heightened sensitivity to novelty extends to its internal experience. New thoughts, an unexpected connection, a realization, a shift in understanding, generate a mild dopamine response. This means the act of thinking, in an ADHD brain, is mildly self-rewarding in a way more pronounced than in neurotypical brains. The mind that won't stop at night is not just compelled, it is, in a neurochemical sense, enjoying itself, not in a way that helps with sleep, but in a way that helps explain why the instruction "just stop thinking" fundamentally misunderstands what is happening. Reviews of ADHD and sleep interventions have found that one of the most effective approaches for ADHD sleep onset difficulty is not medication, not behavioral therapy, and not environmental modification alone. It was consistent sleep timing. Adults with ADHD who maintained a consistent wake time across 7 days showed significant improvements in sleep onset within 2 weeks. The brain does not need to be told when to sleep. It needs a consistent anchor from which to calculate backwards. The wake time trains the circadian rhythm, and the circadian rhythm handles the rest. The anterior insula, a brain region involved in self-awareness and the sense of being present in one's own body, shows reduced activation in ADHD during rest. This contributes to the dissociated quality that many ADHD adults describe at bedtime, the sense of being present in thought but absent from the body. The mind racing while the body lies distant and unfamiliar. Grounding practices. The deliberate return of attention to physical sensation. Work neurologically by activating the anterior insula, rebuilding the bridge between mental and physical experience. The body is not separate from the thinking. It is the thinking's floor. Omega-3 fatty acids, specifically E to P, A, and D, H, A, have been studied in multiple randomized trials for both ADHD symptom severity and sleep quality. The mechanism involves their role in neuronal membrane fluidity and dopaminergic signaling. Research, including meta-analyses of supplementation studies, has found reductions in sleep onset latency and improvements in sleep quality in ADHD populations, though effect sizes vary across studies. The brain's biology is not separate from its behavior. What the system runs on shapes how it runs. And this particular fuel has consistently shown up in the research. The relationship between ADHD and time perception creates a specific nighttime challenge researchers call temporal discounting. The tendency to devalue future rewards relative to immediate ones. For the ADHD brain, "I'll sleep now and feel better tomorrow," is a genuinely harder calculation than "I'll think about this one more thing right now." The future reward is not as neurologically compelling as the immediate reward. This is not short-sightedness. It is neurology. And understanding it as neurology changes the way you relate to the staying awake. from a failure of will to a feature of wiring. Alpha waves, the brain's relaxed but awake frequency, associated with a calm, receptive mental state, are harder for ADHD brains to sustain during eyes-closed rest. Research using neurofeedback training has shown that ADHD adults can learn to produce alpha waves more reliably, and that this training reduces pre-sleep rumination over time. The brain can be trained, not through discipline applied to thought, but through practice applied to frequency. What the nervous system learns to produce, it eventually produces more, naturally. The brain that learned to race can learn to glide. The experience of time collapsing, the sudden awareness that hours have passed without feeling like time, is common in ADHD and particularly pronounced during nighttime thought spirals. Sleep researchers describe this as temporal compression during high cognitive engagement states, a well-documented phenomenon in which immersive mental activity suspends subjective time. The person who says, "I have no idea how it got to be 3 a.m." is not exaggerating. They experienced a state in which clock time and internal time were not connected, a state the ADHD brain slides into easily, like water finding its level. Researchers studying long-term outcomes of disrupted sleep in ADHD adults have found that chronic sleep deficit is associated with elevated inflammatory markers, including interleukin-6 and C-reactive protein. Inflammation in the brain disrupts the very dopamine and norepinephrine systems that ADHD already taxes. The result is a self-reinforcing cycle. ADHD disrupts sleep. Disrupted sleep worsens ADHD symptoms. Worsened symptoms further disrupt sleep. This is a documented biochemical loop, and the entry point for interrupting it, research consistently suggests, is the sleep itself, not the ADHD. The ADHD brain's default processing style, simultaneous, associative, non-linear, is often described by ADHD adults themselves as parallel processing, multiple streams of thought running at once, each partially developed, none fully completed. This is different from anxiety's single-loop rumination. It is closer to how a composer might experience a symphony in progress. Many voices, many threads, nothing yet resolved. At bedtime, this parallel processing is experienced as noise. In the morning, the same brain may find that several of those threads have quietly woven themselves into something coherent. The overnight work, chaotic as it feels, is not always wasted. Social pain, the experience of exclusion, criticism, or misunderstanding, activates the same neural pathways as physical pain in all humans. But studies suggest ADHD brains show a stronger and more prolonged response. The midnight replays of difficult interactions are not self-pity. They are the brain responding to a genuine neurological event. Social pain, with the same persistence and attention it gives to physical injury. You would not tell a broken bone to stop being painful by now. The brain's response to social injury deserves the same understanding. Long-term studies following ADHD adults across decades have found something that early deficit-focused models did not predict many ADHD traits: the wide aperture attention. the creative associativity, the emotional depth become assets in professional and creative contexts, particularly in middle adulthood. The adults most likely to thrive are not those who suppress their ADHD most successfully. They are those who structured their environments to work with the way their brains actually functioned. The brain that could not stop thinking at 25 becomes, with context, the brain that sees what others miss at 45. The vagus nerve, the longest nerve in the autonomic nervous system, running from brainstem to abdomen, is a key regulator of the transition from sympathetic to parasympathetic states. Vagal tone. The flexibility of this transition is typically lower in ADHD, meaning the nervous system struggles to shift registers from alert to rest. Practices that stimulate the vagus nerve, slow exhalation, humming, cold water on the face, have been shown to increase vagal tone over time, improving the nervous system's ability to make that shift. The switch is real. It can be strengthened. Some researchers have proposed that ADHD's most consistent neurological signature, reduced inhibitory control, actually serves a different evolutionary function than pathology implies. In environments requiring vigilance, rapid response to novelty, and diffuse environmental monitoring, reduced inhibitory control is a significant survival advantage. The brain that cannot stop scanning is an excellent sentinel. The brain that follows every interesting stimulus is an excellent forager. The mismatch is not between the ADHD brain and what brains should be. It is between the ADHD brain and a specific modern context that rewards sustained, quiet, externally directed attention. Research on ADHD and flow states. The experience of full immersion in an activity to the point of effortless sustained attention shows that ADHD brains enter flow states more readily than neurotypical brains and experience them more intensely. This is the dopamine system working at full capacity interest, high enough to sustain attention without effort. The same brain that cannot follow a boring instruction for 10 minutes can follow an interesting project for 10 hours without noticing time pass. The attention is not missing. It is selective. The system is operating exactly as designed. The design just disagrees with the calendar. Chronobiology, the science of biological timing, has identified multiple circadian differences in ADHD brains that go beyond sleep. Body temperature rhythms, cortisol rhythms, and hunger rhythms all shift later in ADHD. This broad circadian delay suggests that ADHD is not just a cognitive or behavioral condition. It is in part a temporal one. The ADHD person is not living at the wrong pace. They are living in a slightly different time zone. Biological clocks set an hour or two behind the social consensus. Everything they do is technically on time, just on their time. The relationship between ADHD and long-term memory is more nuanced than working memory deficits suggest. While ADHD brains struggle to hold information in short-term working memory, long-term episodic memory, particularly for emotionally significant events, is often intact and sometimes heightened. ADHD adults frequently report vivid recall of specific scenes, conversations, and sensory experiences from years past, while forgetting where they put their keys this morning. The past is not dim for these brains. It is, in places, almost too clear. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, adapted for ADHD, specifically addresses the pattern of thought identification, the ability to observe a thought as a thought, rather than being absorbed by it. Neuroimaging studies have shown that consistent practice produces changes in default mode network components that correlate with reduced mind wandering and improved sleep onset. The brain does not learn to stop thinking. It learns to notice that it is thinking and to relate to the thought differently. That small distance between being the thought and watching the thought is where rest becomes possible. The role of the hippocampus in ADHD sleep offers a key insight into why the nighttime thought spiral so often involves memories. The hippocampus consolidates episodic memory during sleep, and in waking hours, it continuously encodes new experiences. In ADHD, hippocampal processing is less efficient, meaning more experiences remain insufficiently encoded at bedtime. The mind then tries to do the encoding work that should have happened incrementally throughout the day. The replay of the day's events before sleep is not nostalgia or anxiety. It is the hippocampus doing its job on a compressed schedule. Research has found that ADHD adults who received psychoeducation structured information about how their brain actually works, showed significant reductions in self-blame, shame, and the emotional weight of nighttime thought spirals. Not because the thoughts stopped, because the frame changed. When the staying awake was understood as a neurological event rather than a character flaw, the suffering around it reduced substantially. The thoughts were the same. The relationship to them was different. And that difference, it turned out, was nearly everything. Overthinking is not the enemy. It is the cost of a brain that has never learned to consider anything too small to be worth understanding. A brain that finds everything potentially significant, that cannot file things away before they have been fully felt, that keeps the tabs open because somewhere in the architecture, something decided that unfinished things matter. That is not a flaw. That is a feature. The remaining facts carry a different quality, not the science of what is wrong, but the science of what has always been true. The brain has been working this whole time, not against you, for you, towards something it keeps trying to complete. There is a moment, in the water, when the current changes direction, not because it was told to, because the shape of the riverbed changed. You are the riverbed. The thoughts are the water. They will find their way. The next hour is gentler. Let it come. You have probably heard the instruction to let your thoughts pass like clouds. For an ADHD brain, this is almost always unhelpful. The clouds are interesting, and following interesting things is what the brain does. A more useful image might be, let your thoughts be weather. Weather doesn't need to be followed. It doesn't need to be stopped. It just moves across terrain that stays where it is. You are the terrain. The thoughts are passing through. Sleep itself is one of the most significant regulators of the ADHD brain's chemistry. A full night of adequate sleep increases dopamine receptor sensitivity, meaning the same amount of dopamine produces a stronger, more focused signal the next day. Every good night's sleep is a recalibration. The brain wakes up closer to the version of itself that can sustain attention. regulate emotion, and close the tabs it needs to close. Sleep is not the absence of ADHD, but it is the closest thing to a reset the brain has. Slow breathing. Specifically, extending the exhale to twice the length of the inhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system through vagal stimulation within 60 to 90 seconds. This is one of the few interventions that works faster than the thinking mind, because it bypasses it entirely. The breath does not require permission from the thoughts. It works while the thoughts are still running. You do not have to stop thinking to breathe slowly. The body will follow even while the mind continues elsewhere. Weighted blankets have shown benefits for ADHD sleep in controlled trials, with effects attributed to deep pressure stimulation, sustained pressure that activates the proprioceptive system and reduces cortical arousal. The mechanism is similar to being held. Deep pressure triggers a parasympathetic response through the peripheral nervous system, bypassing the cortex entirely. No thought required, no discipline required, just wait. And the body's ancient understanding of what wait means. Research on ADHD and narrative suggests that ADHD brains respond particularly well to stories at bedtime, not because stories are distracting, but because they provide a pre-structured thought path. Instead of generating its own content, the ADHD brain follows a narrative that has already decided where to go. The cognitive load is low. The engagement is just high enough to hold attention without generating new open loops. A voice narrating something gentle gives the tabs a single page to be on. The experience of hypnagogia, the imagery and sensations at the edge of sleep, is often richer and more sustained in ADHD than in neurotypical brains. ADHD adults frequently report seeing complex scenes, hearing sounds or music, and experiencing kinesthetic sensations more vividly at sleep onset. This is not a sleep disorder. It is the ADHD brain doing what it does at the threshold, creating. The entry into sleep for an ADHD brain is often a creative act, full, vivid, and then quietly gone. Studies examining sleep outcomes in ADHD adults consistently show that good sleep improves not just attention and executive function, but emotional regulation, social sensitivity, and self-compassion the following day. Well-rested ADHD adults rate themselves as more patient, more forgiving of others, and more forgiving of themselves. The thoughts that felt like verdicts at 2 a.m. look different at 9 a.m. after real rest. The brain that reviews itself harshly in the dark tends to review itself more gently in the morning. Researchers have noted that ADHD adults who accept their sleep differences, who stop fighting the delayed circadian rhythm and instead structure their lives around it, report significantly higher sleep quality and life satisfaction than those who continue forcing neurotypical schedules. Acceptance is not defeat. It is accurate data collection. When the brain is allowed to sleep on its own timeline, it sleeps better. And when it sleeps better, everything else becomes slightly more possible. The phenomenon of second wind in ADHD, the burst of energy and mental clarity that arrives after the point when sleep should have come, corresponds to a cortisol pattern that occurs in the late evening in many ADHD adults. This peak is not useful for sleep, but it is useful for understanding the brain is not resisting rest out of stubbornness. It is responding to its own chemistry. The second wind is not a choice. It is a tide. And tides, eventually, recede. Research on gratitude practices in ADHD has found that spending 2 to 3 minutes before sleep noting specific, concrete things that went well that day, not abstract gratitude, but actual instances, can reduce pre-sleep cognitive arousal over time. By deliberately filling the last minutes before sleep with positive episodic content, the mind encodes more of this as the final memories of the day. The sleeping brain tends to process what it was last given. Give it something worth carrying in. Temperature is a meaningful sleep regulator. Core body temperature needs to drop to initiate sleep. And ADHD brains are slower to complete this drop, partly because of elevated metabolic activity. A cool room, between 65 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit, accelerates this process by facilitating heat loss through the skin. The brain does not have to be told to sleep. It just needs the physical conditions that make sleeping easier than not. And temperature is one of the simplest to provide. Eye movement patterns at sleep onset differ in ADHD. The transition from waking eye movements to the slow rolling eye movements that precede sleep takes longer and is more frequently interrupted by returns to waking state movement. This is a direct correlate of the cognitive activity still running at the surface, the brain tracking its own thoughts the way eyes track moving objects. As the thoughts slow, the eyes follow. The body knows when the mind has finally let something go. There is emerging interest in the relationship between gut microbiome composition and ADHD symptoms, including sleep. The gut-brain axis, mediated in part through the vagus nerve, influences neurotransmitter availability, including serotonin and dopamine. Preliminary research suggests ADHD populations may show different microbiome compositions than neurotypical groups, and some probiotic interventions have shown modest effects in small studies. This area is early and should be interpreted cautiously, but the direction of inquiry is meaningful. The brain is not only in the skull, holding sleep to an impossible standard. Quiet thoughts, immediate onset, perfect refreshment, is neurologically harder for ADHD brains. When sleep falls short, the brain adds the shortfall to its failures list. But research shows that subjective sleep quality often diverges from objective data. ADHD adults frequently sleep better than they think they do. The brain's verdict on its own rest is not always accurate. The night that felt restless may have done more than it seemed. Blue light from screens suppresses melatonin in all humans, but ADHD brains appear more sensitive to this effect, and recovery to normal melatonin levels after exposure takes longer. This makes the final hour before bed disproportionately influential. An hour without screens does not require perfect willpower. It requires only that the transition is made easier than the alternative warm light. Comfortable space. Something gentle to occupy the hands. The brain follows the easiest available path. The work is in making rest that path. Self-compassion practices, specifically those focused on shared humanity rather than individual performance, have been shown in multiple trials to reduce ADHD-related shame, improve emotional regulation, and lower pre-sleep rumination. The key is not positive self-talk. It is the recognition that struggle is a feature of being human in a particular brain, not a sign of something broken. The ADHD brain that is hard on itself at night tends to believe the difficulty is proof of inadequacy. The science says otherwise. Background sound, at a slow tempo, roughly 60 to 80 beats per minute, with low melodic complexity and no lyrics, has been found to facilitate sleep onset in ADHD adults more reliably than silence. The mechanism is entrainment, the brain's tendency to synchronize its own electrical rhythms to external rhythmic input. Slow, steady sound provides a pacemaker for the brain's own timing system. The brain doesn't follow the rhythm because it has to. It follows because that is what brains do with rhythms they trust. The way the ADHD brain talks to itself at night is often the same voice it was given in childhood about its attention, its effort, its worth. The harsh midnight reviewer is not native to the brain. It was learned, and learned things can, over time, be unlearned. Not through one dramatic insight, but through the slow accumulation of evidence that the brain doing the reviewing deserves the same patience it might offer to someone it loves. The default setting of the ADHD brain, high sensitivity, wide aperture, deep engagement with whatever captures attention, is also the setting that allows profound connection, genuine empathy, and the kind of presence that makes people feel truly seen. The same neural machinery that opens too many tabs at night is the machinery that, in the right moment, opens to another person fully and without reservation. The gift and the difficulty are the same thing. They were never separate. Acceptance and commitment therapy, adapted for ADHD, has produced consistent improvements in sleep outcomes across multiple trials. The core mechanism is not thought suppression, but psychological flexibility, the ability to hold difficult experiences without being controlled by them. In the sleep context, this means the thoughts are here. They are not a problem. They are not an emergency, and I can allow them to be present while also allowing my body to rest. Not the absence of thoughts, the absence of war with them. The nighttime experience of the ADHD brain, the spiral, the replay, the invention, the connection making, is, in the broader arc of a life, part of what makes ADHD brains memorable to the people who love them. The quality of thinking that feels like a liability at 2 a.m. is often the quality that makes the thinker extraordinary at other hours. The same thread runs through both a mind that doesn't do things halfway, that takes everything seriously, that has never learned to let something be unimportant. Sleep is not passive rest. It is active consolidation, the brain sorting, filing, strengthening, and discarding, performing the editorial work that produces clarity, creativity, and emotional balance. Every night, the ADHD brain allows itself to rest. It gives itself a gift that compounds. One night is a small repair. A week is a recalibration. A year is a different baseline. A brain gradually catching up on the maintenance that the waking hours deferred. The tabs that won't close are not keeping score. They are holding open things that felt worth holding, and they will still be there in the morning. Nothing left unfinished tonight becomes a permanent failure. The brain that holds open loops is doing so because it cares about what is in them. Caring is not a problem. The timing is simply misaligned with sleep. And misalignment, as all of tonight's science has shown, is not a verdict. It is a pattern, and patterns can change. There is a particular quality to the rest that follows a long thinking session. A depth, as though the brain, having finished what it needed to process, sinks more fully into restoration. ADHD adults often note this: the nights they thought most before sleep are sometimes the nights they woke feeling most rested. The thinking is not always the enemy of sleep. Sometimes it is the preamble. You are not a person with a broken brain who cannot sleep. You are a person with a thorough brain that has not yet been given permission to stop. The permission was always going to come from here, from the recognition that what the brain is holding tonight has been held, and honored, and worth the attention. You do not have to finish it to rest. The tabs can stay open. The browser can sleep. That is enough. All of it is still here. The thoughts, the open loops, the things you haven't figured out yet, and underneath all of it, this, breathing, the body you never had to manage, the weight you didn't have to carry. Just here, you are allowed to dissolve into this now, as far as you want to go. There is a kind of tired that is also a kind of full, not empty, finished, or finished enough. The brain that has been working all evening, running the tabs, revisiting the day, building connections no one asked for, was not doing something wrong. It was doing what it has always done, holding everything it touched at full resolution, refusing to let anything be small. That brain is yours. That fullness is yours. And tonight, for the first time or the 100th, you are giving it something it may not have been given often enough: the understanding that it doesn't have to close every tab to be worthy of rest. That the unfinished things are not failures. They are evidence of a mind that genuinely cares about what it encounters. You can rest with them still open. The overthinking is not the opposite of peace. It is peace, trying to find its shape. ADHD Sleepy Facts has been returning to the same question across many hours. Not how to quiet a brain like yours, but what it might feel like to stop needing it to be quiet. That video is waiting whenever you are ready. Let the tabs stay where they are. Windows open on a screen in a room where no one is required to read them tonight. Let your breath find the pace it uses when no one is watching. Sleep carries you to the place where the work is already done. But if your eyes are closed, stay there. Rest well. Thorough mind. You were never thinking too much. You were caring too much. In a brain built to feel every bit of it. Where science becomes the softest place to rest. Good night.